The company's stock was soaring. It hit a record high that was well above previous record highs. This was January of 2022. The pandemic, the supply shock, customers were loaded with cash. The good times everyone thought were going to last forever. Except over the last couple years, the customers disappeared. The company has reported increasingly negative same-store sales, and its stock is down about 85% to its lowest price since 2009. I'm talking about Advanced Auto Parts, and its story is emblematic of the past couple years. The artificial high of the supply shock that is slowly fading from view. And for some, that fade has been more catastrophic than for others, yet it's in there in everything. The only question is degree. We see consumer spending that keeps slipping, including October retail sales that we just got this week. We also got industrial production that is sliding lower too. So it's not just Advanced Auto Part that is having to close stores, and management notes lay off workers, though they won't say how many workers are going to end up being laid off. There are too many of these stories peppered throughout the economy, because what Advanced Auto Parts shows only too well is the downside to the supply shock that we're still grappling with here at the end of 2024. Not a soft landing, not necessarily even recession risk in the US. It is still the downswing cycle that a lot of other indications are saying we've got a lot more of this to go, including the US dollar's exchange value, as I've gone over in the last couple of videos. So we got retail sales, we got customer spending, we got industrial production, and a whole bunch beyond that are consistent with this continuing downturn on not just the US, but the entire global economy. So Steve, let's start with retail sales. Retail sales came out for the month of October. Some people said they were really good. Some people said, like the GDP control group, which is shockingly negative. People have been blaming seasonal factors. But overall, the retail sales, it doesn't matter the monthly variation. The trend continues anyway.
Yeah, absolutely, Jeff. It's all about the trend. And when we talked about Advanced Auto Parts, it's really a great example of what's going on with retailers all over the country. Because, when you look at their business, is demand for people to fix their cars, did that really go away? Or was it the fact that people don't have the money to go buy the parts to fix their cars? And I think it's a monetary issue, because people do need to fix their cars. And it's not like all of a sudden cars got, so good that they never break anymore. So Advanced Auto Parts business model is failing. But when you look at their report of what they said, they're saying we're going to close 700 stores. And that's a significant amount. That's not, hey, we're going to get rid of a couple employees here and there. We're going to close 700 stores. And that's not just going to affect their workers. It's going to affect a lot of other people. And you think, their rent that they pay, at their locations. But then upstream from that, they said, we're going to close a couple warehouses because, well, we don't need them either. And then upstream from that, their suppliers said, hey, because demand's going down, we're going to actually adjust our projections as well. And you and I know when they say that, it means we're going to have to trim our production lines, which means hours are going to get cut, jobs are going to get cut. So you can see it all comes back to the consumer here. I don't think they have enough money, Jeff. And that's what we're seeing in retail sales. We're seeing that downward trend is they just can't afford these higher prices. And that's leading to demand to drop at a time when supply is going higher.
Yeah, with Advanced Auto Parts, like you said, Steve, it's not like we stopped fixing our cars. That hasn't changed. Or suddenly everybody just takes it to the local shop. There are a lot of do-it-yourselfers out there that continue want to fix their own cars. They can't afford it. And what Advanced Auto Parts has said is that the last 3 quarters in particular, so going back to early part of this year, late last year, something big happened to their customers. It was before they were struggling. 2021 was great. Everybody had money. Their customers were loaded with cash. They came in, bought all the expensive stuff that they could. And it slowly started to transition in 2022 and 2023. But then something happened late in 2023. And of course, we know what that is. We've been talking about it since then. Since last year, we told you that there was an inflection in the economy. And that's what Advanced Auto Parts said. We saw something big happen with our customers, and now they're really not coming into our stores, to the point that we have to close hundreds and hundreds of our shops, as well as everything else that Steve just said. And that is consistent, by the way, with the retail sales figures when you step back and look at them, and certainly on a year-over-year basis. As I keep pointing out, anything less than 3% is solidly in the danger zone for a recession. And sure enough, retail sales over the last 7 months solid have been growing at a less than 3% rate. In fact, the average 6 month average year over year change in retail sales as of October, including the latest figure, is just 2.47%. So well below the 3% range. It's consistent with what advanced auto parts are saying. Consumers are indeed really struggling here.
Yeah, absolutely, Jeff. And a lot of people, when they look at the retail sales data, they don't understand this in nominal terms. I mean, it's not inflation adjusted. So you mentioned, hey, if it's under 3%, and there's a good reason you mentioned that, because there's a factor here. If inflation's going higher and you think, oh, wow, look, retail sales is going up, is it going up because more people are shopping, which advanced auto parts would say, well, they're not at our store? Or is it because prices are going up? Now, if we adjust it for the consumer price index, which isn't probably the best way to do it, but really the easiest and only way we can do it, what you find out is going back to 2022, in fact, late 2021, there was this huge drop in retail sales. And it's largely been negative on an inflation adjusted basis since then. So we're looking at almost 3 years of negative real retail sales. And this is not a good sign for the economy, because you think as a business owner, yes, okay, my prices are going up and I'm selling things at a higher price, but I'm selling less things. And they've been holding on and holding on. And we've been talking about the election. Everybody's been put all this notion that demand's going to come surging back once the election's over. But what if it doesn't? And that's the risk here, because a lot of these employers, they're not big companies. They don't have massive credit lines. They can't go issue stock. There's a point where they don't see customers coming in buying, they're going to have to cut more of their workers. And that's exactly what we're seeing throughout the economy, is people can't afford these higher prices. They can't afford the discretionary goods, and their spending is dropping.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple big things there that we really want to focus in on. First of all, real retail sales. That's absolutely the case. You look at real retail sales through October, and the 6 month average year over year change there is minus 0.3%. As you were saying, so in nominal terms, we're paying 2.5% more to get roughly on average 0.3% less. That is falling further and further behind, and it's exactly what people have been feeling. And that's the reason why voters were turning to Trump to begin with. And the other thing is, if Trump represented a major shift in the economy or major opportunity in the economy, then manufacturers and producers would be producing in anticipation of it. And the latest data we got from the Federal Reserve on industrial production shows the exact opposite. Now, you could say, well, they didn't know that Trump was going to win, and maybe that was too uncertain. But manufacturing and industrial production overall have been flagging and falling for about 6 months on average. Industrial production today, again, was down for the third time in the last 4 months. Manufacturing was down even more. Again, I think it was third time in 4 months or fourth time in 5 months. So the manufacturing and production part of the economy actually lines up with retail sales being weak, consumers buying fewer goods, even though they're paying a little bit more to do so. Advanced auto parts saying we're not selling as many goods as we would like to, and now we're being pressured into the point where we have to cut back on a lot of our own production. We're seeing that across the entire goods economy, which is consistent with everything that we've been talking about. So it all adds up to the same thing, which is 2022, early 2022, everything looked really, really good, but that was all an illusion, a price illusion. And slowly over the last couple of years, that illusion has been revealed. And what's being revealed is, like we're seeing in these statistics, it's not really about a recession. It's about where the economy actually needs to go in order to rebalance itself in some more stable fashion.
Yeah, Jeff, and that's interesting because we talk about how supply and demand needs to balance out here. And this is interesting because when you look at the relationship between real retail sales and industrial production, you get something very interesting, aside from the fact that we see industrial production numbers get revised lower. We see next month will probably mean this month is getting revised down, but there's a direct relationship. So we can kind of go back to what happened with advanced auto parts. They said, look, our customers stopped coming in and buying stuff. So that means we stopped ordering as much stuff from our wholesalers, who stopped ordering as much stuff from the manufacturers. Now, when we take a look at industrial production and overlay it against real retail sales, we can see where there's a huge drop starting around 2022 in real retail sales, and they remain negative. But you look at the slope of industrial production, it's been trending down. So you see at the manufacturing level, they thought, well, maybe people will come out and spend. So we'll keep producing. We'll keep stuffing the channel with stuff. And next thing you know, inventories went up. But now all of a sudden, industrial production's flattening out. It's close to being negative. Maybe it even is negative at this point. I'm not sure. I'd have to look at the data. But what that's telling us is the manufacturing sector is on the verge of forced to have to lay people off. And so you look at the trajectory of the economy, it's not going in the right direction. People think, hey, we've got a new president. We got the one that's going to turn the economy around. But, Jeff, we talk about just because you put a new captain on the ship and turn the wheel doesn't mean the ship moves. The economy's too big for one person. Trajectory here is not going in the right direction. And from my standpoint, I think it's going to accelerate more to the downside in the months to come.
Yeah, what you're talking about, Steve, really isn't. Trump, he doesn't even take office until January 20th of next year. That's a couple months away. So what we're really talking about is that the belief that sentiment is enough to turn everything around, right? That everybody's now happy that a Republican is in the White House, a Republican Congress, Republican Senate, Republican House, and that just because it's different from the last several years, which obviously did not go well, that's the reason why we've had a shift to begin with, that just the fact that business leaders and companies and managers will be comforted by the fact that things will be different on a national level, that somehow that sentiment is enough to turn around what has been a 2-year-long downturn that had previously shown very little sign that it was going to turn around. And I think that's just, when you stop and put it in those terms, it starts to sound more and more ridiculous, because it's just giving way too much credit to, like economists do, pure sentiment. So if we're counting on just happy feelings being able to turn around everything in a very short period of time, I think that's why you look at other indications like the US dollar going up that suggests that, yeah, the chances of this happening aren't good. In fact, whatever you think about Mr. Trump and his policies, he's inheriting a situation that's already much more difficult than the one he inherited in 2016. I did a live stream about this where I made those comparisons. It looks a lot more like 2001 than anything. So there's a very difficult set of circumstances. Even if you believe in the Trump administration, he's starting from much further back, which means the task to turn everything around is much greater to begin with. And even if he could, it would take a lot of time for those policies to have an effect. So we're talking about, at the very earliest, maybe the middle of next year. Meanwhile, we're like the Fed, we're looking back here at the data that's coming in, suggesting things are still turning lower. Steve, you mentioned manufacturing. Manufacturing jobs, even according to this establishment survey, have been contracting, and pretty solidly contracting over the last 6 months. Yes, there was some distortion in October's number because of the Boeing strike, but even without Boeing, the manufacturing jobs would have been down by roughly 20,000 anyway. So the ship is already moving in the wrong direction, and it takes a long time to get it to move back in the right one.
Yeah, Jeff, you put this in perspective of using the ship analogy. And let's say we're on the Titanic and we just hit the iceberg and, we're taking on water. Does changing out the captain change the situation? It doesn't. And that's the problem here, because maybe sentiment does work. And it's good that people are excited now and think the economy is going to turn around. But there's only really one aspect that can really change it, is if they reach into their wallets and actually spend money into the economy. And I don't mean go out and buy Bitcoin or buy stocks. I mean, that financialization isn't going to create economic growth. What we need is people to say, hey, you know what? I am more optimistic about the economy. I believe I'm going to get more hours, or the fax machine is going to start whirring and new orders are going to come in. And I'm going to go out and spend money because I believe in it. Now, we can step back and say, hey, if that happens, that's a wonderful thing. And then sentiment can turn the economy, which is why we look at the data. In fact, Disney had some data out recently that says, hey, the attendance at our parks is going down. And you know what? I can tell you, Jeff, as I've been to a few of them lately, they are going down. And part of the reason, and this is interesting, is they keep raising their prices. And I've noticed that there's just an objection now. People that used to come and hang out at the parks, locals that I would meet there, they're not coming because it's now getting too expensive. So you start looking around the economy and you ask yourself, are people going to spend? And at the moment, it doesn't appear that way. It's more along the lines of, hey, I'm going to go buy stocks in Bitcoin and hopefully you'll go out and spend and then I'll get rich.
Well, that's the point, right, Steve? We get to that point where companies and businesses have been raising prices the last couple of years because they think they can get away with it. And eventually they get to that wall where they start raising prices and suddenly people stop showing up. And so at that point, there's only two ways to reconcile that imbalance. The first is to cut your prices back, dial them down substantially to start getting demand back in again. And in any type of commodity where there's a liquid marketplace, like oil prices, for example, that's what ends up happening. Unfortunately, that's not the way it works in the real economy, where we don't have a market to say you're way overpriced on your goods relative to the actual fundamentals. So what happens is exactly what we see with advanced auto parts. They have to, instead of cutting their prices, which they can't do because their input costs are essentially fixed too, they have to cut back on their capacity, which means closing things, which means firing workers and shuttering capacity in stores and factories and warehouses and everything else. And so advanced auto parts is not the only one that is faced with this decision. That's what we keep coming back to, is that they're making the decision to cut way back on their capacity because that's the only way they can reconcile with the business that they have. Other companies might want to cut costs, might want to cut prices, but they can't do that either. So they're going to have to be faced with the same choice, which is to cut back on their costs where they can, cut back on their capacity, cut back on their output and investments. So what we're seeing in the consumer economy, industrial production, advanced auto part is so much of the US and the rest of the world being forced into that position, which is what we're saying is really the warning signs that we're seeing all around pretty much the data, the markets, and everything else.
You know, Jeff, I'm glad you said the word capacity because it's a really interesting because it comes in line something called capacity utilization. We get that with the industrial production data. And, you know, you hit it spot on because the idea here with advanced auto parts is, yeah, maybe they could cut prices, right? Maybe they could go out to their shareholders and say, hey, you know what? We're going to take a little bit hit here. We're going to cut down our margins just to keep our customers coming in. But instead, they didn't say that. They said, look, we're just going to close stores. And that's interesting because when we look at capacity utilization, which is the percentage of a factory that's being utilized, you can overlay the unemployment report or you say continued unemployment claims, whichever unemployment statistic you like. And there's an immediate and direct relationship. As a percentage of a factory being utilized declines, well, the unemployment rate rises. And so we look at this, it all comes back to the consumers not having enough money. What we see at Advanced Auto Parts saying, hey, look, people aren't buying stuff. We're going to cut stores and, as you said, warehouse and distribution. But you look at the factory level, they're forced to cut because they have no choice. Their biggest cost is labor. And if you've got people staying around, you can only sweep the floor so many times before you've got to send them home. And I know, Jeff, you're laughing, but I actually know people that were in the manufacturing sector. And I said, what do you do when things slow down? Well, we clean the shop and we do this and do that. And I said, then what happens when it's all done? They said, then I fire them.
Oh, yeah. That's really the scenario we're hoping to avoid, and really hoping sentiment is actually the antidote that we need. But, you know, let's end here on capacity utilization, Steve, because that's, I think, the one number that maybe the most important number that came out with industrial production, which was, I think it fell to 74.1%, which was the new cycle low, which means that factories across the US, and I know the goods economy is a small part of the overall, but it is the cyclical part. As the goods economy goes, the rest of the economy will, because it's a reflection of, as Steve, you're pointing out, it's a reflection of consumers' ability to spend, not just on goods, but also services. And so when they're pressured, you see it first and foremost in the goods economy. And with capacity utilization continuing to decline to a cycle low, that tells you that businesses in the manufacturing part of the economy, in the goods economy, are getting to this point where they have to say, I just can't hold on here. They've swept the floor 37 times and I can't do it for number 30. I just can't afford to. I have to make some bad decisions, some decisions I don't want to make. And as they do that, it just leads to this cascading effect where we continue to see weakness across everything else. That's what the labor data has been showing since the summertime. And that's what the rest of the macroeconomic statistics show as well. It's interest rates. It's the Fed. I love how the dollar is, before it was, the dollar is too strong because the Fed won't cut rates. And then the Fed starts cutting rates, and now it's the dollar's too strong because the Fed's not cutting rates fast enough. It's almost like you're trying to tie everything that happens to the Fed in some way or another.